Thanks very much. It's been kind of fascinating for me just sitting here listening to all this amazing information. I should just thank you for the invitation to come here. It's kind of strange for me in a way because I suppose, although I've often caused to talk publicly or go to literary events or read poetry, that kind of thing, I've never actually spoken publicly about my own experience of epilepsy, and I suppose I really haven't spoken privately even that much about it. In that, for a lot of my life, I never really gave it much thought. I kind of didn't want to think about it. I think I kind of swept it away, or I pushed it aside and swept it away, and I kind of ignored it. Even at the time in my life when it was causing, I suppose, most trauma or damage. And it's a kind of strange sort of thing because, say, as somebody who writes, I've written about kind of everything else that has happened of significance, but never gone near this. And I was just lying in bed a few years ago, and with something like a flu. I was kind of recovering from a flu, and I just had a sudden desire to write about the experiences that I had with this. And I've had it. I've had it for about 40 years. I mean, I've had it since I was a child of, I think, it was about 11 when it first happened. So I started to write, and it became an essay which was published in a literary magazine, the Dublin Review, and then it became the basis of a documentary that was made by RTE, and then it appeared in the newsletter, and I suppose that's why I'm here. So I apologise to those for whom the information might be familiar. I think part of my tendency to push it all aside came from my own childhood experiences, which were basically unfortunate encounters with the medical system at the time. I'm sure it wouldn't happen now, but it happened in my case. And what happened was that when I was young, I kept falling. And that's why I call the piece "Falling," the original piece, because what would happen to me was I'd get up in the morning, I'd go down, I'd wash my face, and at the moment the water touched my eyes, I would conk out. And so I'd find myself on the floor. And I kind of thought, well, this is normal, because whatever happens to you becomes your own reality. So this kind of happened for a long time. I would just get up, go down, wash my face, fall. And so that became my kind of reality. It sounds kind of odd, but then once I fell and I caused myself a bit of damage, I split my head, and so at that point I had to go to the hospital, and that began a series of encounters with I suppose the medical system that weren't great, because I went. How would I put it? I went to see what happened. You go to see, in my case, a consultant kind of neurologist in a children's hospital in Dublin. And I had to kind of tell him my story. And I suppose I realized that what you have in a way is a kind of story or a narrative that you have to tell somebody. And so you are reliant on them, in a sense, to believe your story. A story which you can't prove or you can't necessarily authenticate, and this was the problem for me, in that I had the stitches on the back of my head. That was all my evidence, and the doctor arranged for EEG tests, and that became for me a kind of torture over the years, because for a strange thing, the thing that happened to me happened at a very specific time every morning. It was always an early morning or sometimes a late at night kind of phenomenon. But the EEG was always scheduled for the afternoon for 10 years, I think. So that the result, I felt like I was kind of doing a lie detector test and failing it, because the EEG tests produced kind of normal results. And the result for me was that the neurologist, he initially provided or prescribed I think it was a valproate tablet, but then as the EEG tests proved positive, he withdrew all of the medication, and I suppose it was then that it became kind of exciting for everyone in my life, because once that kind of inhibiting medicine was gone, my body could give full rein to the strange force that lay within it. And so I no longer was just falling, but at this stage I began to produce the full-blown seizures and the what I learned later were called grand mal attacks, with all that foaming at the mouth and the furious twitching and the biting the tongue and all of that, and then the sleeping for kind of 8 hours afterwards. And the strange thing was, again, I didn't think that much of it, because it's one of the features of it is you don't see it, other people see it. So in a way, for me, it was other people's. I didn't want to be bothered with it, because it was I never witnessed this. I would hear about it often much later from the other members of my family would say, what was that about 3 months ago when you did that? So I kind of pieced the story together from things that I would hear, because it wasn't exactly a topic of conversation in the household. In my own case, like my father was working his way through a neurological disease which would kill him by the time he was 50. So that was the kind of main conversation, if you like. And I suppose if I had any feeling about my body and about this thing that was happening to me, it was a kind of suppressed anger, I think. This wasn't the time for this kind of nonsense. I wanted to be strong. I didn't want anything like this to be happening. But eventually the seizures themselves just got so bad. I mean, I kept doing, falling down the stairs, injuring myself, that my mother pleaded with the consultant to restore the medicine. So he wrote a letter to my GP, which I intercepted and opened, and basically he said, this man's mother is a little bit hysterical, but just give him the medicine for kind of a quiet life in a way. And I think it was because at the time his primary focus was on his machinery, and his machinery was telling him there wasn't a problem. And he didn't, I suppose, believe the narrative that I was telling him. But the medicine did do its work. So for a while, it stopped, or it didn't prevent altogether, but it kind of moderated the seizures, so that I suppose went back to not taking them terribly seriously. And it's like, I think part of this kind of strange relationship that I had with it was that I just didn't take it seriously. And when I was in college in my early 20s, I refused to take even the most rudimentary kind of precautions. I'd stay up all night, drink, all that kind of stuff. And then so I'd be there collapsing at parties. I'd be falling in showers and baths. I'd be having seizures in girlfriends' beds that I'd hear about maybe 6 months later, and wonder what went wrong there. That was, So I'd have these kind of things like bouts of unconsciousness as you're talking to somebody. That kind of thing, again, that would be familiar to a lot of you, where you're slipping in and out of consciousness. So you'd be having a conversation with somebody, and then suddenly you're gone from it, and then you're back. And that was always my warning that it was this kind of prelude to an attack. So I had all these kind of what looking back on now were terrible, embarrassing, and shaming experiences, because no one ever spoke about them. I remember being in a friend's house where I collapsed, and the door had to be broken down, and by the person's father, and I'm thinking, this is all, and it was never spoken about. It was kind of like I went home the hundreds of miles from where that house was, and so this kind of strange but unspoken and obviously vaguely kind of embarrassing kind of thing had happened. But I suppose it was. Again, I went away then. I lived abroad for many years, and I didn't take a prescription with me. I didn't do any. I used to have my drugs sent over from Ireland, but again, after a while, after a few years, that kind of stopped, and I never sort of did anything much about it. And so then, I was my own worst enemy, because then what happened was sort of, I remember particular occasions, like I was swimming in the Adriatic once, and I must have been about maybe 30. And I could feel myself beginning to black out. And luckily, because for me, it's a combination of light and water seems to act as a trigger. And I managed to get myself out of the water before doing any kind of major damage. But I started to realize, this is stupid. I better actually do something about this. And I was back in Dublin, and I went to another neurologist, and I hated neurologists. I hated medicine. I hated, and it was partly because, again, because I'd seen my father die of an undiagnosed kind of neurological disease, which eventually kind of settled on multiple sclerosis. So I kind of had years of seeing doctors and just having a negative feeling about it all. And that was part of my problem, I think. Still is to an extent, maybe. But what was that? So what happened was that I went to see this neurologist, and suddenly, and he used the word epilepsy. You have epilepsy. And he used all these words that then became part of my awareness of it. Epilepsy, grand mal, tonic, clonic, generalized, and all this kind of stuff. And that's always one of the things that I suppose strikes, people who come to epilepsy or to people who have it themselves. There's all there's a dramatic language around epilepsy that isn't quite around other diseases. It's like even the fact that there is the noun, a person is an epileptic. It doesn't apply to other kind of conditions. So all of this, in a way, I got great comfort in that I felt I'd got some sort of certainty that I had walked out of. I'd kind of graduated from some kind of school of certainty. I'd been given this thing, and I can remember the neurologist kind of sitting there looking at me skeptically and saying, "I know you literary types. Out all night drinking in the arts club. You have to take some basic kind of precautions." And I did, and I went on, and it was fine actually. It was kind of controlled, and I took the kind of rudimentary precautions, and it all kind of was a little bit fine. But I think my own kind of detachment about it from it was, I suppose, tied up with that initial failure to diagnose it and to treat it properly. But it was probably also an internalization of the sort of residual shame or embarrassment that surrounds or the millennia of misinformation that has been directed against epilepsy for so long. I was also angry with the actual system, and I still get angry when I think how few neurologists there are in this country. I think there's fewer than 25 in the whole country. I think the provision in this country is so poor. I think it's among the worst in Europe, and I think the relative invisibility doesn't help. But I don't know. The other thing, I suppose, it's part of the general comedy of maleness. I think that we're not given to the ready release of the streams of information that the body or the self, or the emotional life are busy collecting and circulating. So I suppose I spent a lot of my life as if the constituent parts of it belong not to me but to someone else. And then I started to get interested in it, and in all the information that I found out about it, and I started to kind of get seriously, kind of looking at it. And looking at the treatment of it, throughout history. I think this is, again, will not come as any surprise to anyone. The kind of drama of it throughout the millennia. I became interested in what the Greek root actually means. This kind of thing of being seized or overwhelmed by surprise. And depending on where you lived and when you lived, this was either sacred or demonic. And there's so many prophetic epileptics. So-called throughout history, from Balaam the seer in the Old Testament to Cassandra in the Oresteia to Hercules. In fact, the French or the Greeks used to call it the disease of Hercules as well. Or Christianity. There's a famous incident in the New Testament where a distraught father brings his son clearly with the classic symptoms of epilepsy to Jesus for healing, and Jesus, of course, heals him by calling out the evil spirit who resides within him. I was reading a thing last week, actually, in the Times literary supplement, and there's a biography of an executioner in the city of Nuremberg in the 16th century. But this little snippet was in it, which fascinated me. In some parts of Germany, well into the 19th century, the blood that spurted from the severed neck of executed offenders was caught in beakers by epileptics and drunk on the spot, signifying its life-giving qualities, perhaps also its sacred nature, coming as it did from a person who had been absolved by a priest immediately before making what was commonly regarded as a good death. That was a kind of a fascinating idea of a cure. But all of this, I mean, as I kind of read into this, and there's all these people who have had epilepsy throughout the years, and you think of all these, the kind of Pope Pius IX, or Joan of Arc, or Dostoevsky, or Molière, or whatever, and you think, we all do this thing where you kind of look for, fellow sufferers. Some people try to make a case for links between epilepsy and spirituality even. I mean, I found myself slumped one night over a paper written in 1970, Sudden Religious Conversions in Temporal Lobe Epilepsy. And I wondered, well, what about atheism and epilepsy? Are there any studies on that? Or some people, because if you have more than one kind of odd thing in your life, sometimes people make a connection between them. So people say, well, is there a relationship between creativity and epilepsy? And I have no idea. I don't think there is. But I do think that I do like that notion of being possessed by surprise, because it's one of the things that I think of about creativity is that you are taken over by another kind of dimension. So there is that absence, there is that kind of withdrawal. That's the only kind of thing I can take from it. I mean, I can't. I'm aware of my time here. I mean, what I should say is that this thing has accompanied me for over 40 years. It's obviously very much a part of my life. For a very long time, it was a part that I ran away from and hid from and ignored. And that really changed in the last while, and particularly once I began to get, I suppose, proper treatment in the moment. I came into contact with people like Norman Delante there, and I suppose took the proper drugs and moderated the lifestyle enough so that I can now feel confident enough that this condition will not, and hasn't in fact hindered me from achieving anything that I have wanted. And I would hope, I mean, my version of it is easily controllable and livable with. And I think it's, I'd be safe enough in thinking that the experiences that I would have had in early childhood would not now be repeated. So that's kind of all I really want to say. It's one journey. It's one sort of slightly messy, awkward, clumsy sort of journey. But it's just the journey that I had. So thanks for listening.